For the purpose of this lesson, I'm going to begin by loading up the Visual Studio Express for Desktop IDE. And you can see, because I've opened it previously, that it's showing me that option in my recent items list within the Start menu. But of course, if it's not there for you, you can go to All Programs, Microsoft Visual Studio 2012 Express, and then select the VS Express for Desktop link. And for those of you who may be using a full version of Visual Studio, you can certainly open up a full version of Visual Studio and follow along with these videos. Now, when you first launch the IDE, what's normally displayed as the default is the so-called Start page, and this gives you access to a number of different items. For example, if you want to create a new project, you can simply click the New Project link. If you want to open an existing project, you can click the Open Project link. If you're working on a team of developers within a company, you may have a so-called Team Foundation server, and that would be where the source code for big applications is stored, and people can work through the Team Foundation server to collaborate on larger applications or even small ones as well. Down at the bottom here, we have the recent list of projects that we've been interacting with. So if I wanted, for example, to open up the Painter app that I demonstrated to you in the preceding lesson, I could simply click the link for the Painter. Notice, by the way, when I hover over that a little pin icon shows up to the left here. What that does is it allows you to pin that project into your recent items list. Normally what happens is only the most recently used apps will show up in the recent items list, but if you always want to keep it there, you can click that pin icon, and now it will always be there no matter how many apps I create until I eventually unpin it from the recent items list. And you'll see these pin icons in a number of different areas within Visual Studio. So for example, on the Start page here, if I wanted to pin that so that it's always displayed, I can go ahead and toggle that by clicking it, and when it's vertical it means that it's always going to display, and when it's horizontal it means that I can dismiss it. There are also areas within the IDE that are not necessarily displayed at a given time, such as the toolbox here. If I click this, you'll notice that this part of the window expands out, and once again you can see up at the top here a pin icon. If I click the pin icon, it will pin open that part of the IDE. If I click the pin icon again, it will compress that part of the IDE, giving me more area to work with. Now, over on the right side of the Start page, you have a variety of links here, getting started and latest news information for Visual Studio. You do need to be connected to the web to use these capabilities. So for example, if I want to see what's new in Visual C#, I can just click that link and it will open a web browser directly right here inside the IDE, and this is basically an embedded version of Internet Explorer inside the IDE that I can now use to view help documentation or other documentation associated with Visual Studio. So in addition to the basics of the IDE here, of course, one of the things that we want to do is create apps. And so just as a demonstration of how to create a new project, what I'm going to do is click the New Project link in just a moment. Now, before I do that, I just want to point out that the New Project and Open Project links are also available to you as commands a couple of different ways. So for example, up here on the toolbar, I have a New Project icon and an Open File icon. On the File menu, I have a New Project and an Open Project and an Open File option as well. So you have lots of different ways to get to these commands here. In my case, I'll just go ahead and click New Project in the Start page. Now, when you first bring up the New Project dialog, what you're going to notice, especially if you're somebody who's used an Express edition in the past, is that you have the option of choosing between Visual Basic, Visual C#, and Visual C++. Now, of course, we're going to be working with Visual C# in these live lessons videos, so I'll be working from within that node as we get started here. And once you've created a project in a given language, the next time you open the IDE and try to create a project, it's going to assume that you want to create a project in the same language unless you tell it otherwise. So in this lesson, one of the things we'll be doing is creating a simple Windows Forms application, and we can find the project template for that in the Windows node under Visual C#. It is important to select it from the Windows node under C# as opposed to under Visual Basic, because when you create the project, the IDE is going to generate a bunch of source code files for you, and you want them to be generated in the appropriate programming language. And just as a demonstration, I'm going to create a simple Windows Forms application right now. I won't even bother modifying the name and location of the app at this point. We'll do that a little bit later in this lesson. But you can see here the default name for a Windows Forms application is Windows Forms Application 1. By default, it's going to be placed in your Documents folder underneath Visual Studio 2012/projects. You can change that location if you like. And the solution name, which also becomes a folder name on disk containing all of that information, is going to be the same as the project name. When I click OK, it will go ahead and start generating the files. So it's creating the project for me now. And once it's done generating those files, you can see it immediately opens up the form, which is the window that's going to be displayed when this app executes, in the Designer tab. So form1.cs is a C# file that represents the window that you see here, and when you're viewing it in design mode, you get a window in the editor area. When you're viewing the code, which you can do a couple of different ways, then you'll see code over here, and it won't show with the word design to the right of the file name, and we'll show you that in subsequent lessons. Now, so we have our editor area here. You can also see in the Solution Explorer that it's now been populated with a number of different files, one of which is form1.cs. It turns out when you're developing GUI applications that each document that represents a window is not only going to have a visual portion of its representation, it's also going to have a code portion as well. In fact, a couple of code portions. One code portion is the designer.cs file, which you don't typically modify yourself. That's where the IDE writes all the code that represents what you're seeing visually on the screen here in the design area. And then separately, if you right-click on the form1.cs node and say View Code, then what you have is what's known as the code behind file, and this is actually where you would write your source code for the logic behind your app, and we'll start doing that in later lessons. In particular, this is a Windows Forms app, and we have 2 lessons on building Windows Forms app a little bit later in these videos. So this is our design area, and in addition to having the design area, when you select an item within the design area, then the properties window gets displayed, and this is going to allow you to do things like, for example, in the case of a window, set the background color of the window or the fonts that are used within the boundaries of that window. So for example here, you can see in the properties window for the Form 1, which is what's up on the screen here at the moment, there's a lot of different properties. In fact, I can scroll through many more. And by default, they're displayed categorized as you see here, but you can also display them alphabetically. And for example, if I wanted to change the font, you can see the default font here is Microsoft Sans Serif 8.25 points. If I click on that and then click the ellipsis button here, then I get the font dialog, and actually the recommended font for Windows Forms and WPF applications running on Windows 7 or Windows 8 desktop is the Seago UI font. So if I start typing SE, you can see that it jumps down to the Seago fonts, and I can select Seago UI, and the default recommended size is 9 points. So if I go ahead and set that and click OK, now you can see that it's changed the value here in the properties window. Notice that it's now shown in bold to indicate that the property value has changed. And the form resized a little bit because Seago UI 9 point is a little bigger than the default font that was set in the first place. So that's a very brief introduction to the IDE. In the next video, we'll take a look in a little more detail at the menus and toolbars.